All right. All right. So there's a black and white image of the Empress card, the original image. And the difference really that you have between the two cards, because the reason they're both meant to be there is so you can compare them as we go through the lecture. The main difference between the Marseille deck card that Tomberg's text is based on and the Rider Waite card here, which is based on Golden Dawn symbolism, Welsh Grail mysticism, and mythology, and was put together by A.E. Waite, Pamela Coleman Smith, both adepts in the Golden Dawn, under the guidance of W.B. Yeats, another adept in the Golden Dawn. So that's a little known fact about the Rider Waite, about how it was developed. It was Yeats's sort of idea. He told Coleman Smith to do it with Waite. Yeats was too busy writing poems and plays, of course, to do that sort of stuff. He never really did any occult productions in his life, other than that which we see in his plays and poetry here and there. So in his letter 3 of Meditations on the Tarot, which elucidates the mysteries of the third arcanum, the Empress, the anonymous author and unknown friend, as he addresses us, who was Valentin Tomberg, as we now know, further explains what the tarot mean to him. And he situates the arcana as existing in a twilight space between what he calls the mystery and the secret. He says the mystery is protected in another way than the secret. Its protection is its light, whilst the protection of a secret is its obscurity. So mystery is light, secret is obscurity. As for an arcanum, which is a middle degree between the mystery and the secret, it is the twilight which protects it. So in some ways, I like to read that actually as ambiguity. You know what I mean? The interpretation of symbolism in the tarot is necessarily ambiguous and necessarily a fusion of horizons between the objective and the subjective, the objective reality of what those images are, and the subjective experience that emerges from us as a result of those collisions of horizons, or fusions of horizons, as it's called as we call it in hermeneutics. So the twilight protects it, for it reveals itself and hides itself at the same time by means of symbolism. Symbolism is a twilight for arcana. And here on the slide, you can see he elucidates this idea and shows you how it has impacted other occultists from the 19th century up to his time in the 20th century. Tomberg, of course, was born in 1900, so Meditations on the Tarot came out in the 80s, but he died in the 70s. That's a quick synopsis. He started as a student of Rudolf Steiner's wife and then converted to Roman Catholicism because he felt the Catholic Church would be a better vessel to carry mystical teachings into the next age, especially after the Anthroposophical Society that Steiner founded was under threat from the Second World War, when it was made illegal, afterwards, when people were vying for control of it, and it was not really growing. Of course, the Waldorf school system still became the biggest private school system in the world, and it is influential from biodynamic farming to education. But the church or of anthroposophy, the Christian community, and the Anthroposophical Society themselves were too fraught with trouble. So Tomberg moved on to Roman Catholicism, remaining in Eastern Orthodox as well. So he liked to see himself as bridging the Eastern Orthodox Catholics with the Roman Catholics, the West and the East, and he took communion in both churches. Here he says, thus the arcana of the tarot are formulae rendered visible and accessible to everyone. They were entertaining in the past for thousands of people. They were used for telling fortunes by hundreds of people. A few experienced in them a revelatory effect. Court de Gébelin was astonished by them. Eliphas Levi was captivated by them. Papoose was inspired by them. Others followed them and became subject to the strange and almost irresistible attraction of the tarot. They studied it, meditated, and commented upon it, and interpreted it, being stimulated, inspired, and illumined by something in the tarot, which simultaneously reveals itself and hides itself in the twilight of its symbols. And ourselves, there's the question, where do we stand in relationship to the tarot? Then Tomberg does answer this question, don't worry. This question in a way, and he hints to the final totality and depth of his system, for he says we find ourselves and relationship to the tarot in the final of the major arcana, the world or universe card. And he says in which that letter, the final chapter of this book that we are studying, addresses the mystery of the minor arcana. So all of the minor arcana are considered within the mystery of the world, which really makes sense, especially if you consider Golden Dawn practices where only the major arcana are used by the Golden Dawn. The minor arcana are never used in the Golden Dawn at all, from beginning to end, full stop. They're only used in the inner order, and it's in the inner order that then magic for more practical effects is being taught, and there you have the minor arcana being studied. And the minor arcana would be what you need for mundane readings when you're doing divination, of course. So the Golden Dawn only use the major arcana because they're only doing spiritual explorations in the outer order. That would be the traditional form of the Golden Dawn. I'm not taking into account, of course, modern variations or versions of the order and temples. So it's in the final chapter of this book that Tomberg addresses the mystery of the minor or lesser arcana. He says, it's through them that we find ourselves and our full relationship to the tarot, which I think is a fascinating thing to consider, that all of the major arcana themselves are revealing this sort of grand mystery and narrative. But to understand our place in them, we have to really look at the catastrophes and blessings and virtues and vices of everyday life, not just these archetypal high and remote spiritual qualities. The third arcanum, he says, the Empress, is that of sacred magic. Now, there are three kinds of magic, and this is going to get fun here. Magic where the magician is the instrument of divine power. This is sacred magic. Magic where the magician himself is the source of the magical operation. This is personal magic. Lastly, magic where the magician is the instrument of elemental forces or other unconscious forces. This is sorcery. Hold on. The teaching of the third arcanum in the view of the context of the card and its place between the second and fourth arcana refers to sacred or divine magic. So therefore, all magic, including sorcery, is the putting into practice of this. And that's a key point to note here there. Even though he's describing, and we'll discuss his description of magic in a second, because there's some issues there for sure. But he's still saying that they all function the same way. So that's an important distinction. All magic, including sorcery, is the putting into practice of this, that the subtle rules the dense. Force rules matter, consciousness rules force, and the superconscious or divine rules consciousness. This is not an unusual formula for us, for anyone who's studied the idea of the four worlds or the tetragrammaton and the manifestation of force through the lightning flash before it rises up through the serpent. But what he's done here is without any doubt, if you're wondering, has he created a straw man? Yes, he has. This is definitely a case of him creating a straw man. He does that quite often throughout the book. So this is not a bad thing about the book necessarily, but it is important for understanding his agenda, because as much as there are these amazing, profound insights in this text, I mean, there's a reason that cardinals and the founder of contemplative Christian centering prayer these days, Abbot Keating and such people, they're all huge fans of this, and occultists are huge fans. Why? How did such a monumental spiritual text come into existence? Well, with an agenda, with a goal and a desire, and on the way to that goal and desire, there's the slight problem that he doesn't fully have the modern knowledge we have about the history of magic, thus his relegation of the idea of sorcery to where the magician being the servant of elemental or unconscious forces, which I think mostly no sorcerers would claim that. The only time you'd see in actual magical traditions someone claiming to be the servant of the elemental or unconscious forces might be in like mounting ceremonies or traditions that have similar possession rites to Vodun, and traditions with spirit possession as part of the practice of performing the magic. But to relegate all sorcery to a form of the results of the possession is of course unfair, and therefore a straw man kind of argument. The idea that he's getting at, that he's what he's doing with this idea of defining sacred magic is important, because he's trying to present this information and this opportunity to practice, or at least in theory to practice sacred magic in a way that is open to everyone, clergy, laity, priests in the Catholic Church, and parishioners. It's quite a radical thing he is doing here. And so he has to do it carefully. Sometimes when you're reading this book, you have to really keep in mind that this is stuff that was being read by the cardinals and the Pope even, and he wanted it to be not condemned, and it wasn't condemned. It wasn't given, of course, the imprimatur of being like perfect divine Roman Catholic knowledge, which is no surprise there. Most texts aren't. But he wanted it not to be reviled, and it was embraced by many. I think overall the text gave a lot of permission and also confirmation to practices already going on amongst many clergy and laity within not just Roman Catholicism, but Christianity and occultism in general, of course. So the idea that there's this really distinct difference between sacred magic, where there's a connection with the divine, and regular magic, where it's just using personal power. I mean, that is a thing. I mean, that's definitely an issue. Whether a magician uses their own personal energy or leverages a spirit is the distinction between what we call historical magic and modern magic. Modern magic, the idea of drawing energy from ourselves, and this is the kind of magic that's studied by scientists like Dean Radin and others, Russell Targ and them, right? But they're not studying what magicians can do with the aid of spirits. They're working on it. They're moving in that direction and going to do it for sure. I mean, they've said as much, but the idea of using personal energy to do magic is not very historical. Historically, it's usually seen as you need the spirit's aid to make something occur. It's not coming from your own personal reservoir. So the idea that there is a historical tradition, like Tomberg is suggesting here, where magicians were using their own power, or worse, were getting possessed by spirits to do the magic, it just doesn't exist in the historical records in the way that Tomberg seems here to make it seem like it does. Okay. So yeah, there is a little straw manning going on. We can sort of accept it under the idea that maybe it's for a good reason. And so here is the Marseille de Tarot Empress card that Tomberg's chapter and analysis is based on. And the beginning, looking at the 4 levels of this card: the crown, the scepter, the shield, and then ultimately the throne. So the crown represents divine authorization or legitimacy. The scepter represents power and the science of love. The science of love is what he would consider power to be. And he's taking that from another occultist who we'll see in a minute. And the shield is interesting to me because it's the one thing that doesn't exist on the Rider-Waite modern tarot card of the Empress. She also does have the crown. She has the scepter, albeit, of course, a different scepter, but still gold, as this scepter is meant to be gold as well, if were it colored, and there are colored Marseille decks. But here, her shield is a heart on the ground with a Venus symbol in it. Here, she's holding it in almost like to be as the high priestess holds the book. Here, the Empress is holding the shield with an eagle on it. An eagle in alchemy represents sublimation, the liberation of the soul. And that's very, very important to Tomberg's interpretation. He says it is this latter rulership that the Empress symbolizes, that is the superconscious or divine over the consciousness. He says her crown and scepter and shield, or coat of arms, are the 3 instruments of the exercise of this power. The crowned head indicates the power of the divine over consciousness. The right arm, according to the viewer of the card, which bears a scepter topped by a cross mounted on a globe of gold, represents the power of consciousness over force. And the left arm, which carries a shield bearing an eagle, signifies the power of energy over matter, or the volatile over the gross. Okay, so yeah, it's obviously in her left arm, but it's in her right arm from the perspective of the viewer. All right, so let's look at these symbols because there's a lot in them. The crown. It makes perfect sense that the crown would represent, of course, authority or legitimacy. The priestess had a crown, and the layers of the crown is of great significance. And so the priestess had 3 layers, which we discussed when we did that chapter a couple months ago. But this Empress has a 2-layered crown, and Tomberg cites two prominent French magicians to inform his interpretation of this key symbol. He quotes Josephin Paladin, who we'll be discussing a lot more in the future as he features often in the book. And Paladin, of course, was a fascinating magician and writer and character in the French Belle Epoque. He created his own Rosicrucian order and did many art salons that based on Rosicrucian symbolism, bringing together artists and philosophers and performers and writers and musicians to do the Salon de la Rose Croix in France. And he was associated once in a while for a little bit with Papoose, but Papoose, or Gerard d'Encaux as his real name was took a turn more into the political intersections of occultism, which of course was, a chaotic thing at those times in the early days leading up to National Socialism. So they were those threads that connected with occultists are well known and well studied. So some occultists dabbled a bit too much in the politics, and others would just throw their hands up and say, I don't want anything to do with that. Like similar to sort of Mathers doing the same thing in France himself with the Jacobite cause, and people like Yeats schisming and taking the order with them, essentially, because they just didn't want anything to do with that. They had their own troubles, literally the troubles in Ireland going on. So that's that interesting. But Paladin also said to be freed, what is the art of sublimation of man? To be freed from the negative aspects of oneself and one thing and of things. For Paladin, being a magician, to be a mage was to be a character. It was to emphasize the height of your personality. Be like Goethe said that the personality is the greatest treasure of the children of earth. Right. So the personality is not this thing to be chipped away at and refined to the point of it being some sort of homogeneous automaton, like perfect, Ken or Barbie doll, so that we're all the same. We're all enlightened and just vacant. No, Goethe thought very much that the wide range of our personalities is where we see God the most. It's where we see the character and the humanity of God, if you like. And Paladin very much thought that way. Paladin did not work with spirits. This is, again, the beginning of the modern magic era that we see starting to snowball after Mesmer, really, after Mesmer. And this idea that humans have spirits as well. We don't just have to work with spirits. We can also work with our spirit. And we have capacities to do things, not just relying on spiritual creatures or angels and demons to aid us. And of course, we all know that very well from practices, from everything ranging to from astral travel to ESP, and you name it. There's all of that going on. Papoose said magic is the science of love. Magic is the application of the strengthened human will to accelerate the evolution of the living forces of nature. Now, that's a bit more spirit world animistic than Paladin's interpretation, for sure. And Tomberg really is going to run with both of these ideas at the same time. A very interesting way, of course. Tomberg says, one asks oneself today, just as in the past, if it is morally legitimate to aspire, without talking of exercising, to an exceptional power, conferring us with dominion over our fellow beings. So that's what the question of authority and the crown and legitimacy is really about. It's about the question of what role does magic play in the world, but we don't see it his analysis come to fruition until we consider the significance of the throne that the emperor sits on. One asks oneself if such an aspiration is not due in the last analysis to vaingloriousness. And this is something that I think every occultist or spiritual practitioner, this is something you should keep in mind and wrestle with forever. This is not the kind of thing you should just figure you worked out and then move on. It's the kind of thing you should always be aware of, and if only to keep humility in check. And if it is compatible with the role that all sincere and believing Christians reserve for divine grace, be it immediate or be it acting through the intermediary of guardian angels and the saints of God. Now, I italicized that bit at the end because it's quite important. There's another part in this really key quote that is important as well, and it can almost slip by, except it's sort of set off. He says, without talking of exercising. And that's an interesting one because, again, it would almost just blow by your attention if you didn't think about it. So one asks oneself today, just as in the past, if it is morally legitimate to aspire to exceptional power, conferring us with dominion over the fish of the air and the fowl of the sea and every creeping thing that creepeth over the earth, according to Genesis, right? And this is a big debate amongst spiritual practitioners, occultists, magicians, witches, wizards, you name it these days. Of course, the relational question of interaction with the divine and spiritual beings versus the more domineering, authoritative, commanding role that has been so well caricatured of late from the grimoire practices of Solomonic magic, and even the older PGM spells have a lot of this declarative I reign over you way of working. He says, without talking of exercising, because it's just a reminder that he is in all of these discussions. I mean, you could get distracted from it by some of the talk of gods and angels and saints and Christ and the Pope. I mean, this is a Catholic work wrestling with Catholicism, but for a lot of us who aren't practicing Roman Catholics, that can be a struggle, of course, to wrap our heads around the context in which he's presenting this information. For other people, it's a delightful thing, and of course, for some, this is all blasphemy. So he's talking about the magical techniques and practices that most of us do, and the need to exercise them, from meditating on a single point, the point of infinite space, right? This basic idea that you find in everything from the Golden Dawn's Meditation 1 to most Eastern traditions have the meditation on a point. Zazen, it's the main technique, a point on the wall. You pick a point on the wall and meditate on that. Though, of course, these traditions extend much beyond just this simple practice. But he throws in a quick little reference there to exercising without talking of the need to like practice and develop these techniques. So it's interesting to note that he's saying that practice is necessary to even do this in the first place. And then he references the fact that the doing of such magic would be involving intermediary angels and saints. So ancestor spirits and spirits, angels, which could be, maybe fallen ones too. He doesn't really clarify at this point. This is odd because not only does Tomberg condemn all ceremonial magic explicitly, of course, but he also, especially if you read his biography, really considered there to be only one ritual, only one magical ritual, and certainly one that appealed to him the most and he felt was most important. In addition to the rosary, it was the Eucharist. The Eucharist was the only ritual he felt was necessary. It's the grand, perfect, total ritual. But before he died, he wrote this book, and here he's referencing doing sacred magic with intermediary guardian angels and saints. So there's a contradiction going on there. And I think what's most likely is that he didn't have a problem with working with spirits or the saints of God, or didn't have a problem with other magicians who did. He just, again, was trying to be careful and to smuggle it in, as it were, into the Catholic Church with this book. I think that's what was going on. It could be debated. Maybe he didn't practice at all, but I think that's unlikely given he was such close friends with Martinists who do practice magic. They do practice ritual magic. As a magical practice system predates even the Golden Dawn as a magical order of ritual practice. And the only thing is they're only allowed to practice theurgy. So if they were to want to work with demon kings or Solomonic magic or elemental spirits, that might fall outside of the category of theurgy. So if he was a practicing Martinist, which I think it's likely he was, and just downplayed it a bit, especially in this text, then he needs to find a way to negotiate that with his sort of philosophy of what's appropriate and what's good magic, what's sacred magic, and what's bad magic, what's black magic. He says the magus in sacred magic plays the role of the last link in the magical chain, which descends from above, i.e., in order to serve as the terrestrial point of contact and point of concentration for the operation conceived, willed, and put into action from above. So Tomberg continues on that point to say that, in fact, when one is this last link, when you wear the crown of legitimate magic, and say again, all magic that is not crowned is illegitimate, the crown makes your magic legitimate. So if you're wearing the crown of the Empress, this this representing this point of contact between yourself and the divine, then your magic's legitimate. You see how all of a sudden the categories are loosened up? Like, how can someone say that who also thinks ceremonial magic, who condemns ceremonial magic? It's like saying, oh, all magic's bad unless God lets you do it. That is sort of what it's saying. Tomberg's indictment of non-sacred magic aside, let's remember here that the first arcanum, the Magus, the magician card of the tarot, represents will, specifically represented by the point of contemplation or the point of concentration. This then opens the Magus. This then opens the Magus to receive the wisdom of the second arcanum, which is the High Priestess, who in this schema represents gnosis, as we discussed last lecture. This gnosis is then the dialogical legitimizer that Jesus Christ is the operative force behind. So sacred magic, which we see now is subtly different from theurgy in Tomberg's schema, arguably and reductively a Christianized form of theurgy, really, because theurgy came from the pagan world, from the Chaldean oracles. And here we have now a Christianized theurgy called sacred magic, essentially, which produces the kind of miracle that Tomberg considers them magic to be. Magic is all a form of miracle, but the difference is it's still magic because of the intermediary. So what we would often call actually thaumaturgical, we would call the manifesting down of events or effects into the world. We'd call that thaumaturgy, wonder working. That normally would be banned for Martinus. Martinus would normally be told not to do that, just to do theurgy. So what Tomberg has sort of done, in my opinion here, is created a new definition of theurgy, which is Christianized theurgy, and he calls it sacred magic. And in that process, he's also opening up the categorization to expand it even further beyond what theurgy includes and to bring thaumaturgy into that expansion, thus allowing perhaps even things like the Enchiridion of Pope Leo or other little books of grimoire magical practice that are, Christian books with psalms most of the time, but then with some spells and stuff at the back that get often darker the further you go to the back. But if that's done in the right way, rituals like that, what might some consider lower magic rituals, could be done within this system of sacred magic, arguably, from the points that he's giving. So while Tomberg sets Christ as the legitimizer and facilitator of magical miracles due to the Magus's role in the operation, Tomberg asserts that this is still magic. Moreover, it is, of course, open to clergy and laity alike. And there's some beautiful passages in the book. I mean, obviously, if you haven't read it, it's very beautifully written, even as it is in translation out of the French. It's been translated in many languages. He wrote it in French, which was his 6th or 7th language. He spoke a lot of languages and was fluent in a lot of languages. And he chose French for the reason that he thought French was the best language to write that book in, which is very interesting. So there's a dual will going on of the Magus and Christ, or God, or your holy guardian angel, really. And he's aware of those things. He's not ignorant of those languages. He's not saying Christ because he doesn't know the intermediary role of the holy guardian angel is a thing. He's very familiar with that. That's why he quotes things like MacGregor Mathers and all these hardcore occultists throughout the book, because he's giving a little nod to people who are in the know that he's familiar with that literature. And if you think he's referencing it, he probably is. So the dual will, represented again by the crown of the Empress, represents the Magus in harmony with Christ, in harmony with the divine. So the personal magic is turned into divine magic through that connection, and represented by the Empress, who is the representation of sacred magic in totality. The dual will crown, therefore, also represents the mystery of Deus et homo, God and man, also, which is a phrase found on the back of the Golden Dawn Adept Lamens. And for Tomberg, this is the distinction between personal and divine magic. If it's crowned with the divine will, it's divine magic. If it's not, it's personal magic. It's pretty simple when you get down to it. In some of the nuances come later on, though. I think, in fact, you could say a book like this never would have had to be written if the church would just sort of admit that they're all wizards. Is it not natural that he who participates each day in the mystery of the transubstantiation is called, in the first place, to sacred magic? His argument is that if people are called to go to the Eucharist every day or participate in this fundamental Christian ritual of eating the bread and wine, the body and blood of Christ, and feels transformed by that ritual, how could you not want them to take that into their daily life? How are they not called to then represent that transformation or transubstantiation throughout their entire existence, throughout everything they do in the world? So another way to say this is that there is a power born from the simultaneous accordance of the divine will with the magus, and that this accordance of wills of the divine and the human, and you might have experienced this in your own practices, I wouldn't be surprised, that when you have that divine accordance going on, there is an additional thing produced from that accordance. What makes it magic, and not just a regular miracle, is the role of the magician as intermediary, as an intermediary will, allowing and helping the operation to take place, but acknowledging that it's God's will ultimately. And in an interesting way, this not only sets apart sacred magic from theurgy while still encompassing much of it, but furthermore, as I said, expands it to include what many would consider even Goetia or low magic. So long as the two wills unite through Jesus Christ, it would still be sacred magic. There might be some Tomberg scholars who disagree with me, but I would love to hear their arguments, because I think this kind of loophole that I've discovered in this chapter in particular is not only very exciting, but very true. I think it's an actual loophole he sort of created and baked into his system here. I don't know how many people have noticed this, of course, and I'll tread carefully, but something that he would have had to be clever about, right, when he's navigating the realm of Christian magic especially. But the loophole, I think, is clear. It's clear for anyone, clergy or laity within even the Roman Catholic Church, to appeal to Tomberg's argument to justify even the practice of perhaps Solomonic magic or Abramelin with the demon kings and all. I think that's what could be argued from this reading of the text. Quite a long ways away from just the off-the-cuff statement that ceremonial magic is bad, or that, you know, he will oppose it. If someone said I oppose ceremonial magic and then said all of this stuff, you'd be like, I don't think you do. So yes, of course, when Tomberg talks about, as you find out in the chapter, when he talks about personal or ceremonial magic or personal magic is simple. Just I allegedly cut off from the divine, as if many people today would argue that you can't cut off from the divine, that you're always interwedded and interwoven with everything in the universe. So the idea that of a separation between you and divine is too Cartesian even to consider. But I think, as most practicing magicians know, and all of us involved in some form of this kind of work, we know that even though we might be interwoven, the experience of that interweaving has degrees and gradations, and therefore you're going to feel more connected and united with the divine will after meditating or doing ritual or some similar practice, of course, rather than just when you got home from work and had a shower and went to the bathroom and then made dinner. You might not feel as interwoven as you do after a long day of fasting and meditating. But he doubles down here. He says the priesthood includes numerous thaumaturgists, St. Gregory, St. Nicholas, and St. Patrick, which is sufficient to convince us that sacred magic is truly amongst the works of the priesthood. Tomberg says the life and work of the holy priest of Ars leaves no doubt. Ars in Latin means art. It's often used as a name for magic. This might also be a place in this case, I don't know. Leaves no doubt that the response is affirmative. The life and works of the holy priests of Ars shows us the loftiness and splendor of individual sacred magic. So personal magic's bad, divine magic's good, but now there's a new thing that's also good: individual sacred magic. How that's different from personal magic is simply just the addition of God's will, or that Jesus said it's okay. If it sounds funny, it is funny. Don't worry, it's okay to laugh. Beyond the universal sacraments, which is able to manifest itself in the life and work of a simple country person. So he's appealing to some stories and popular tales and hagiographies of known faithful Catholics that worked wonders or miracles by practicing magic. He says, but on the other hand, the life and work of Monsieur Philippe of Lyon shows us the loftiness and splendor of individual sacred magic, but without the universal sacraments. So even if you don't have the sacraments, you can do sacred magic. Whoa, we're getting far off the reservation of the Vatican at this point. So it's able to manifest in the layman born and raised in the country, or in the nobleman who goes to church every day with his family and gets front row seats at the cathedral. That's what he's saying. And that's, of course, because of love, because it all comes down to love. This is love. God is love. Definitely in Tomberg's view, God is love. The church is meant to be and is at its core universal. Tomberg definitely, even as he converted from Eastern Orthodox to Roman Catholic while holding those two in tension with each other in his life, still saw beyond that the church needing to be Ecclesia Universalis, the universal church. That's what it had to be. That's what it was at its essence. And all these organizations and groups, and even Rome and the Pope, he still saw them as just the best that we've done. It's like he didn't hold them on the pedestal that I used to think he did as a convert to Roman Catholicism. I thought he really did think, go full in for all of those dogmatic doctrines. But no, it's more that he thought, look, this is the best organization we have so far to carry things forward and to provide some hope for humanity. Because this is a guy, let's not forget, who lived through both world wars. He was a noble in Petersburg, a lower noble, chased out by the Bolshevik Revolution. He had to flee Tsarist Russia because his dad was a lesser noble and they would have all been executed. They fled back to where their family was originally from in Estonia, and his mother got caught by the Red Guards and executed for not telling them where he and Tomberg's father was. So then he had to live through the Second World War, living in Amsterdam and being starved and all of that. So this is someone who definitely had a good reason. I mean, given that he died in the 70s, he got the full gamut of 20th century wars, more or less. And it makes sense that he would then look at institutions and from a very pragmatic point of view, like, is this institution going to cause a genocide? Is it going to die out, or is it going to carry on? And he thought the Catholic Church was a good one to carry on. I think if he was alive today and had lived through all the what we found out about the depth and extent of the priestly abuses, I think he might have changed his mind on that as well. But he didn't have that information. So therefore, it's here that the order of things in sacred magic is given. Firstly, real contact with the divine, which is mysticism. Then the taking into consciousness of this contact, which is gnosis. And lastly, the putting into operation or the execution of that which mystical revelation has made known as being the task to accomplish and the method to follow. So is he referring to divine will, but also the techniques that most of us follow to do ritual magic? Regarding ceremonial magic and naturalism, we can only condemn them as much as for their uselessness, as for the formidable dangers they contain, and for the state of the soul which they suppose. In fact, one understands here, under this last designation, ceremonial magic, an operation where the human will and intelligence alone are active, without divine occurrence. This is from Pappus. I think it's the clearest case of a straw manning of your enemy's views on magic that you could ever hope to see. Even people practicing Goetia or doing black magic usually contact their higher will or God, as they know, however they consider it, before they're doing it. I don't think I've ever even heard of a magician saying, I really want this thing, so I'm going to do this. Now, inevitably in popular occultism, people were doing personal magic or doing things for selfish reasons. I want to get laid, so I'm going to do a love spell, and hopefully this girl gets compelled by spirits towards me. People were doing that, and there's nothing wrong with criticizing that, as far as I can tell. But the way they're doing it with ceremonial magic and naturalism it's not accurate. It's not an accurate interpretation of naturalism. It's a myopic interpretation of one form of naturalism, you could say. And again, the word ceremonial magic here is just being reduced to a very small period of time. He reduces it. Their critique of ceremonial magic is sort of humanist, Renaissance or late Renaissance, early Enlightenment humanist ceremonial magic. And for some reason, it's like that. It's just that thing where, you know, you want to say what I'm doing is ordained by God, but what you're doing isn't. And it's that simple. It's easy to do and not incredibly useful for understanding. So this quote by Pappus is from Pappus's Traits élémentaires de sciences occultes, Paris, 1888. So that book was published the same year the Golden Dawn was formed. It seems the straw manning of ceremonial magic that we saw also at the beginning of this chapter was likely something Tomberg learned from Pappus. The scepter. Perhaps you will say, but this is the Holy Grail. It is the mystical Eucharist of which you speak. Yes, this is exactly to do with the Holy Grail or the mystical Eucharist, for it is there and only there that the power of sacred magic resides. He said this before. We've discussed this idea before. This power is, in the last analysis, that of twofold sincerity, divine and human. So again, this theme of uniting the two wills to create the magical, sacred magic effect, united in the human word or action. The agency of the human being, of course, is crucial. And he points later on to some biblical accounts of miracles. Yes, so he equates the Eucharist and the Holy Grail, the mystical Eucharist with the mystical Holy Grail, perhaps. Tomberg clarifies the supreme symbolic and arguably practical unity, which is represented by the scepter of the third arcanum of the Empress, and he says, because not one word or action is truly sincere when it is only cerebral. And when it is only cerebral, then it is not a flow of vital blood. The more sincerity there is in the human word or action, the more there is the vital essence of blood. When it happens and the angels fall down in adoration when this occurs, that the human wish is in accord with the divine, the holy blood is then united to the vital essence of the human blood, and the mystery of the God-man is repeated. And also the miraculous power of the God-man is reiterated. Here is the power of sacred magic, or its scepter. So that's the symbolism of the scepter, this union represented at first by the crown and its dual layers, then by the scepter, which holds the divine will above and the human will below and unites them together, as above, so below. And there's a bit more he says on the scepter. He talks a lot, mostly about the scepter in the chapter. There's much less said about the shield and then the throne. The next part is interesting because he brings back the issue with what this is for. He says, at this point, it becomes hard to deny that essentially Tomberg is endorsing the use of sacred magic or sacred magic as a method for the magus to enact miracles by uniting the personal will with the divine will of Jesus Christ. But that said, then the methodology, whether theurgic, thaumaturgic, or even arguably goetic, is authorized. Using angels or demons to free someone from possession or illness is then to free that person. And liberation is achieved by sublimating ourselves to free ourselves through essentially God. And that's why he says neither Satan nor Belial nor Lucifer nor Mephistopheles have ever deprived anyone of his freedom. He says temptation is their only weapon, and this presupposes the freedom of he who is tempted. And this is going to move us towards the shield and the symbol of the eagle as a form of liberation. And that's why it's so important that he reminds us that we're not actually getting liberated from evil forces. We're getting liberated from ourselves, because these demons or spiritual forces can't actually do anything to the soul. And especially in Catholic doctrine and dogma, that's very true. One of the flaws in interpretations of exorcism, and I don't mean in real life, I'm talking theologically. So there's with Catholicism, of course, there's the theological way things are, and then there's the way things are in real life, and they don't always line up. In fact, often they don't line up. So there's the practice of possession and exorcism in the church, but then there's the theology of it, which is sometimes different, especially insofar as the theology says that the soul can never be affected, and you don't really have access to your soul either, according to strictly to Catholic theology. Neither does your soul contain the essence of God or Christ, according to Roman Catholic theology at all. There's no substance of the divine in the human being, according to the Roman Catholic Church. But we do have souls, but they're untouchable by demons and devils, even Satan. It's temptation that is the danger. And that's where Tomberg picks these ideas up in an interesting way. He says, but possession by an evil spirit has nothing to do with temptation. It is invariably the same thing as with Frankenstein's monster. One engenders an elemental being, and one subsequently becomes the slave of one's own creation. The demons or evil spirits of the New Testament are called in today psychotherapy, neuroses of obsession, neuroses of fear, fixed ideas, etc. So he's actually going to a psychological interpretation, which is surprising. They have been discovered by contemporary psychiatrists, he says, and recognized as real, i.e., as parasitic psychic organisms, independent of the human conscious will and tending to subjugate it. But the devil is not there to no avail, although not in the sense of direct participation. He observes the law which protects human freedom and is the inviolable convention between the hierarchies of the right and of those of the left, and never violates it, as it stands out in the example of the story of Job. One need not fear the devil, but rather the perverse tendencies of oneself. And also in Job, the role was not of Job to prove himself to God, of course, to prove his faith to God. It was to prove his faith to the devils, which is why God did these things to Job, because the devil couldn't. So God had to do those things to him to prove to the devil his faith. Very interesting book of the Bible. So he says, more on that point, that I do not have the intention of judging, still less condemning hypnosis, magnetism, suggestion, all evocation, right? Ceremonial magic dealing with nature, and practical Kabbalah aspiring to the subjugation of evil spirits. It's almost like he's flip-flopping on his previous statements, right? The sole aim here is to make clear that which differentiates sacred magic from these practices. But therefore, he's also kind of saying that once you do things the sacred magic way, those practices are okay again. It's kind of present, that idea in the text. They can also serve good. See, they can also serve good, but sacred magic can do nothing else than to serve good. So if you're, we're dangerously close to a theology of, if God says you can do it, then it's fine, which is ethically very questionable form of mysticism. If God tells you it's okay, then you're fine. That's a very dangerous way to think. But what he's doing here more is just trying to include things that were excluded. So he's chastised these practices, but then he's defined magic in a way that could re-include them if you wanted it to. So yeah, it's a song and dance. There's no doubt about that. He does a little song and dance to achieve his goal, and he did it very well. Otherwise, this book wouldn't be such a universally acclaimed and beloved text. So Tomberg pointedly notes the greatest evils are never done by any devils or demons, but rather by humans who fall prey to the temptations of evil. He then cites the atomic bombs dropped on Japan as an example, which I think is fair. The perverted human imagination that's fallen to temptation, Tomberg considers far worse than any malicious forces and demons and devils. Tomberg has saved further discussion of those, though, however, for chapter 15, for Arcanum 15. So we'll look forward to an exploration of actual demons and devils. But the point is very, I think, powerful and important and timely, that the worst things that are going on aren't being done by strange supernatural forces, but by humans just corrupted by our own sin, essentially. And so when he's discussing these forms of magic that at first he condemns, but then he sort of re-excuses under the auspices of the divine will or sacred magic. He then touches briefly, and he doesn't do this much in his book, but on the question of grimoires and whether they contain sacred magic or whether you can use them. And basically his answer there is that if God tells you you can use a grimoire, then it's okay. You shouldn't be surprised that that's his answer by this point. But yes, if it's revealed to you that this, and most magicians, here's the irony of that statement, most magicians would tell you that anyway. I don't think I've rarely met practitioners who are spending years learning, developing, building tools, and then working with a grimoire that they didn't feel like a very powerful connection to. I guess it makes sense that you'll, in the learning stage, work with a couple grimoires that you might not resonate with deeply just for the sake of learning. But yeah, I don't think I could imagine many people who are just randomly spending 5 years here, 10 years there, practicing grimoires that don't speak to them or aren't handed to them by God, essentially. So if you wonder what his thoughts are on grimoire magical practices, that's it. It's very simple. Did Jesus say, give you the thumbs up? If so, go ahead. But the question is very interesting. Are there grimoires of sacred magic? Yes, if one understands by grimoire an arsenal of arms or implements which one makes use of. This arsenal is composed of formula, gestures, and figures reproduced by the gestures. But one must not choose them arbitrarily. The choice must be reserved either according to profound knowledge confirmed by revelation, or otherwise to direct revelation confirmed subsequently by the knowledge of experience. So we have said above that sacred magic is life, as it was before the fall. As life is always generative, the arcanum of sacred magic is at the same time that of generation before the fall. Vertical generation from a higher plane to a lower one, instead of horizontal generation, which is accomplished on a single plane. And this is the mystery. This is the formula of these first 4 cards of the major arcana, from the magician to the high priestess to the empress, and then next we'll see at the end to the emperor. And those 4 cards are very significant as they represent this prelapsary and this pre-fall state that we were in. And then that's been replaced by the toils and suffering and death and all that. But then they present to us the mystery of themselves as arcana, of how to re-enter into that connection with Eden, the spiritual prelapsarian state. Then the formula of this mystery is well known, and he describes that through the credo of what's called the Nicene Creed, et incarnatus est Deus Spiritus Sancto ex Maria Virgini. So Christ came through this Holy Spirit. He was incarnated through the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary. And he analyzes that idea of God being incarnated by the Holy Spirit through the Virgin Mary. And of course, parallels to the Egyptian myth story should be evoked in your mind when considering that, for sure. It contains the trinity of the generator above, of the generant below, and of the generated, or the Holy Spirit, the Virgin Mary, and the God-man. The God-man is what's generated between the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary. It is at the same time the formula of sacred magic in general. Of course, he's going to draw his formula from these key points of Christological history. It is at the same time the formula of sacred magic in general, because it expresses the mystery of the union of divine and human will in the element of blood. The blood in its triple sense, mystical, Gnostic, and magical, is the scepter or power of sacred magic. So that is the conclusion to what the scepter represents. It unites the mystical, which is the magician card, the magus, or the unio mystica that occurs through that concentration on a point, the effort without will without effort, that opens you to that mystical union with all as one. And then the Gnostic, which is the manifestation of that mystical revelation through the representation of the high priestess card, who then contains and puts that knowledge into a book that we call gnosis, and that is the artifact of knowledge that we gain from union with the mystical or meditation on that point. And then finally, the magical. The third element of the blood in this triple sense is the magical, which is represented by the Empress herself. It makes sense that magic and blood are connected to the card that represents fecundity and birth and human life and nature, and the changing of the shield. We'll talk about that more in a second. But from the eagle to Venus, it makes a lot of sense, not only because in the Golden Dawn tradition, Venus on the tree of life leads to the sun, which represents the door of Venus leading into the vault of the sun, but also because Venus represents generation, and therefore is the symbol through the Empress of sacred magic. The shield. The aim of sacred magic, as we have said, is represented by the shield that the Empress holds in place of the book, which the High Priestess holds. Sacred Gnosis has as its aim the communicable expression or book of mystical revelation, whilst the aim of sacred magic is liberating action, i.e. the restoration of freedom of beings who have partially or totally lost it. The eagle in flight depicted on the shield signifies this emblem of sacred magic, which could thus be formulated: give freedom to he who is enslaved. So that's the idea of the eagle on the shield. It's this idea that we need to be liberated, and that sacred magic is designed and given to us by God, essentially, and then authorized by God to free us from enslavement, whether that's enslavement from illnesses and diseases like leprosy and lepers getting healed in the Bible. That sort of story is mentioned by Tomberg as a case, or any other freedom from slavery, from oppression, from even, the darknesses and temptations of our own mind, of course, and the dark nights and sins and senses that can overwhelm us in our daily lives. Sacred magic is the gift given to humanity to free us from that. That is Tomberg's interpretation of what the crest or the coat of arms of the Empress represents. So Tomberg gets biblical after that and says this includes all the works mentioned by Luke. Jesus cured many diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and on many that were blind he bestowed sight. And he answered them, go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, and lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them. That's from Luke 7, verse 21 to 22. And the freedom is partly needed because of this sort of human evil more than spiritual demons, or the devil. It's because with the possible perversity of our warped imaginations and corrupted souls and hearts, or corrupted hearts, not souls, we become more dangerous than the devil and his legions. Tomberg says, man is not bound by the convention concluded between heaven and hell. So his theory is that because there's an agreement between heaven and hell not to do certain things, we then have the freedom to do far more evil than these spiritual entities could ever do. That's an idea taken up quite broadly in Western religious literature for the last 2,000 years. He can go beyond the limits. So we can go beyond the limits of the law and engender arbitrarily malicious forces whose nature and action are beyond the framework of the law, such being the Molochs, he calls them, and other gods like of Cana or Phoenicia. He does the thing where he talks about demonic entities and other deities as under the assumption that, of course, they're all false gods and bad, because he's writing from a Christian Catholic perspective. But that's a slightly archaic thinking from where we're at these days, religiously in the world, I'd say, or especially in the esoteric world. But the interesting use of his reference to egregores here is worth noting. It's not entirely exact to how the Golden Dawn imagined this term, but it's good enough and it's close enough. And especially as it characterizes and portrays the things that can cause us to need liberation, to need sacred magic. Because these forces and these bad deeds and ill wills of the human beings gather together and form these egregores and create these sort of, these dark spirits that plague us. A lot of them are of our own creation, is his argument. And I think that some of those ideas go back to Rudolf Steiner and Tomberg's time learning and working with the Anthroposophical Society. But some of these are also somewhat just a feature of the time he lived in, the way that psychology had become so prominent that he's often relegating most possession or spirits to, and especially demons, to psychological states. And that was a fad, that was a vogue that today is being very much overturned, but I think there's definitely still a lot to that. Obviously, many of the cases throughout human history where people thought they were possessed or cursed were just mental illness. That should be something. That's why magicians these days recommend therapy before anything else, and exorcists from the Roman Catholic Church do the same thing. They require you to go talk to therapists and all that. You should always start with, at least consulting with doctors and medical professionals before you turn to the occult. But the gathering together of human wicked forces to create egregores. It's interesting that he addresses it at all. This is why I'm bringing it up and mentioning it. And he does get into more details on that later on. Finally, we are at the throne, the last symbol of the Empress card. And the last symbol of the Empress card, the throne, represents the role of sacred magic in the world and why it's here. If you remember from a previous slide, the basic definition of each of the four symbols: the double crown, the scepter, the shield, and the throne. Tomberg says the throne on which the Empress is seated represents the second he of the tetragrammaton of sacred magic, i.e. its manifested entirety. Her crown corresponds to Yod, the scepter to the first he, the coat of arms to the vav of the tetragrammaton. This is why we have defined the throne as the rule of sacred magic in the world and in history. One could equally say that it is the phenomenon of the whole of sacred magic as it has manifested itself, as it is manifesting itself, and as it will manifest itself in the history of humankind. I hope that's grandiose enough for you. So this is a significant throne here that we're talking about, and rightly so, because the Empress is seated upon it, and the Empress represents nature itself. It is its historical body which reveals its soul and spirit. So Tomberg says what he means by body, he says, I mean that which makes possible direct action in the world of facts. Thus, the arsenal or store of magical formulae and gestures which one uses in the practical exercise of sacred magic are part of its body. So all these tools that many would say allegedly Tomberg never touched or would dabble with at all are part of the body of nature, which is sacred magic. Again, we see an allowance for all the wands you might want to possibly use and every crystal or talisman that you could make. The rituals of its universal operations, destined to serve the whole of mankind and transcending space and time, i.e. the seven sacraments of the universal church, insofar as they are rituals, are equally part of its body. So here he's calling the seven sacraments magic. Then those who have the mission or the ability to perpetuate the tradition of sacred magic are likewise part of it. This body is like a tree which has a certain number of branches, which bear many leaves, but whose roots are in heaven and whose top is turned downward. It has only one trunk and a sap, which nourishes and vivifies all its branches with their innumerable leaves. It's a really beautiful passage and a really beautiful conception of the throne of the Empress, sort of the idea of nature enthroned. It's this idea of nature naturing and nature natured. So nature is creating nature, and once nature is created, nature is then enthroned on itself, and we are part of that. We're branches and leaves, and part of that, as well as everything else, is that recognizes its right relationship to the divine. That again is the governing factor here that would make something kosher or not, for lack of a better word, and that is the right relationship, the dual crowned nature of our connection with God. He says the throne on which the Empress is seated represents, as we have said, the role of sacred magic in the world, but it is its place in the world and in history, and in the history of the world. It is lastly its basis. In other words, it is that which attends it desires, and it is always ready to receive it. What is this? So in view of the liberating function of sacred magic, it is all that which is deprived of liberty and is bound by necessity. Concerning this idea of what liberates us and what justifies the use of sacred magic for ourselves or for someone else or in the world, he turns to St. Paul. He appeals to St. Paul in Romans 9, is it? Romans 8, chapter 8. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. It's always interesting, I think, when people quote the Bible to explain magic and magical practitioners and our role in the world. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in travail together until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. Thomberg definitely believed that there is a physical transformation that's occurring through the practice of magic or sacred magic, and through the development. Thomberg was a big practitioner of developing the psychic senses. Right, that's a feature of him that many people might overlook in their attempt to understand it. It's very easy to just look at him and see all the Roman Catholicism and all the Jesus Christ stuff, but keep in mind this is someone who was extremely skilled and took practicing psychism very seriously. But he happened to learn that from a tradition, being anthroposophy, that didn't believe in boasting about it or even talking about it at all. It was spoken about almost in code. Like you wouldn't say, I had a clairvoyant vision, or I found this out clairvoyantly, or with telepathy. You'd say, I was contemplating myself and had an inner knowing. You would say something like that. And this is still even how I, growing up in the Waldorf school system, heard anthroposophists talk about what otherwise in more occulty circles we would unabashedly say this was clairsentience, this clairvoyance, or it felt like, I heard this thing. And they don't speak quite so brazenly about those things, and that's because of Rudolf Steiner's really important emphasis on humility from the get-go. I think that's always taken under good advisement. So just a bit of a wrapping up review of where we're at and what the significance of the Empress is, in full understanding of the significance of the previous arcana that we studied, the Magus and the High Priestess, and then the next one, which we'll look at next month, which is the fourth arcanum of the Emperor. So Thomberg says he ties these three cards into another verse, a very famous verse from John. For the fall changed the destiny of humanity, so that mystical union became replaced by struggle or toil, gnosis by suffering, and sacred magic by death. This is why the formula announcing the good news that the effects of the fall can be overcome, and that the way of human evolution can return to that of mystical union instead of struggle. Not a subtle indictment of Darwin there, by the way. That immediately reflected revelation or gnosis can replace the teaching of the truth through suffering, and that sacred magic or transforming life. Notice how he says sacred magic or just transforming life. That's sort of a synonym for sacred magic, you could say, with Thomberg, transforming life, can take the place of destructive death. This is why I say this formula has the tenor of the following. He's not making an equation. He's just saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, is very similar to the ideas he's presenting in these three cards. The first three arcana represent the prelapsarian or pre-fall, if you like, qualities before we fell from Eden or got exiled and were blocked by the flaming sword. And he has some nice stuff in this chapter on the flaming sword, but in a lecture, of course, I have to focus on only a few aspects, and these are dense chapters that I hope you take the time to enjoy, not just once, but many times. Unio Mystica, effortless union with the divine. That's the magician card. Then Gnosis, the tree of life, is the unity or synthesis of consciousness, forces, and matter. 3 is its number because it reflects the unity of the Holy Trinity. It is at the same time the unity of mysticism, gnosis, and magic. This is why one should not separate them. Interesting, eh? The Empress, as a symbol of sacred magic, contains within itself gnosis and mysticism, or the high priestess and the magician. So these arcana are incomprehensible when one takes them separately. In general, all the arcana of the tarot, Tomberg says, are comprehensible only when considered as a whole. One of the most interesting things Tomberg does in the sequence of going through the tarot from the magician to the world is he has removed the 0 card of the Fool and put it right before the World card at the end. And that's the unique change he made, because everyone makes a change. Papoose tweaked LF Alevi, and the Golden Dawn tweaked that, and then Crowley tweaked them, and he's done his own little slight adjustment by taking the Fool from the first card before the first card and moved it to right before the last card. So that's quite that'll be interesting when we get there, and to understand why he's done that in his course of this spiritual journey. So the magician is the way, the high priestess is the truth, the empress is the life. What does that leave for the emperor? Well, we'll find out next time. The magician card is the arcanum of the true way, or mystical spontaneity, unio mystica, and the practice is that of the meditation on a point. The arcanum of revealed truth or gnosis is the high priestess. So if the magician is unio mystica, contemplation on the divine and mystical union with the divine through those techniques, then what filters through into our consciousness is the gnosis, that the truth of the high priestess. And then the empress is how we integrate that into our lives and into the world through sacred magic, which is the transforming technology and practices that we do, whether it's just the rosary and the Eucharist, like it might have been for Tomberg, or whether it's the full gamut of Solomonic magic, maybe even witchery, druidry, fairy magic, you name it, Santeria, Vodun. Tomberg in this chapter, and I'm curious to know what you all think, seems to have come full circle. He rejects ceremonial magic, but then defines it, and then defines sacred magic in a way that comes full circle and can re-include a lot of those things under the conditions that, of course, it's in accordance with divine will. And that's what we'll study with the next card, with the Emperor, which represents Hermetic philosophy, according to Tomberg. Of course, we now know Hermetic philosophy is slightly a misnomer, and it should be referred to really as Hermetic spirituality. Some of us have known that a while. Some of us are just finding that out. So that'll make for some interesting analysis in that chapter. And the practical application of Hermetic philosophy is, for Tomberg, alchemy, and that means personal spiritual alchemy, of course. And there's the Emperor card sitting on his throne with another scepter and a little eagle shield again. So we will look at the fourth arcanum, and this will complete the first 3 with the fourth, that create a sense of the first stages of practice and the spiritual sort of network upon which the other cards are then based. The idea of the 4 wounds completed by the 5th wound is a big occult symbol for Tomberg that we'll study as we go from the Emperor to the Pope, or Hierophant card. These represent this transformation, this development of these 3 that becomes the 4, which then are the 4 wounds, and then topped by the 5th wound of spirit that, unites a new understanding of that. But the Emperor is all about the technology and the practice of that sacred magic through Hermeticism specifically, and how that gives us a fuller understanding of these first 4 cards, gives us what Tomberg claims are the keys to understanding the apocalypse. The apocalypse as we know it from the revelation of St. John. And so the Emperor represents Hermetic philosophy or spirituality as we consider it today. And the Emperor represents the initiate and the initiation as it leads into the 5th the following fifth arcanum of the Pope and Hierophant. So that's a very interesting thing that's going to happen as we study the Emperor over the next few weeks and practice, of course, different magics associated with Aries and some Shem work as well. And fire, that fiery spring energy that is so great for getting things started, not necessarily for getting them done, but great for getting things started. So been wanting to start exercising or start a new ritual practice or double down on your diary writing or just get out of the house more or stay in the house more. This next few weeks while we practice Aries magic and the Emperor will be very good for that. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Let me leave you with this one last thought. He says, Eliphas Levi puts as the subtitle to the chapter devoted to the third arcanum of the tarot in his Transcendental Magic, its doctrine and ritual, Plenitudo Vocis. His choice is more than happy. It is inspired, indeed, fullness of voice. Could one better describe the essence itself of sacred magic? Yes, it is fullness of voice with which sacred magic is concerned. It is the voice full of blood. It is the blood which becomes voice. Tomberg clarifies that a bit by saying that the third arcanum of the tarot, being the arcanum of sacred magic, is by this very fact the arcanum of generation. For generation is only an aspect of sacred magic. If sacred magic is the union of two wills, human and divine, from which a miracle results, generation itself also presupposes the trinity of the generator, the generant, and the generated. Now the generated is the miracle resulting from the union of the principles of generator and generant. Whether it is a matter of a new idea, a work of art, the birth of a child, is not important. It is always the same law of generation which operates. It is always the same arcanum, that of fecundity, which is in play. And it is always the same mystery of the incarnation of the Word, which is the divine prototype here. Thank you very much. Let's see if there's any questions here I can address while the recording's still on. Oh, Irene, I'm glad you've enjoyed the podcast. That's great. The terrestrial point of contact and point of concentration in Catholic doctrine would be the priest. I think as the priest is the intermediary on earth to God. Priest is magus, exactly. But Tomberg goes out of his way to show you how it could just be some poor country person who's never even seen the sacraments doing sacred magic because it comes from love, from God. Would documentation of the rosary and the physical ritual that one follows perhaps be considered a grimoire of sacred magic? What about one's personal prayer book? Absolutely. I think all of those could be considered grimoires of sacred magic for sure. I think that's exactly what he'd consider them. The lower self, 7 deadly sins. Yes, we'll talk about more of that in the future. The role of the lower self here in the discussion that we need to unite to the divine will, it's sort of under the constant assumption that we are primarily lower self. Most of us is lower self, and we're all sinful. We all have the 7 deadly sins or 8 deadly sins or however many sins there are. I can't keep up. There's a lot these days. I think we're constantly coming up with new ones. That's why sublimation is so important. The idea of sublimation. So you're not pushing down the nobility of the human personality and the human spirit by sublimating alchemically, right? You're sublimating the sinful part, the false self, the part of you that does something thoughtless or careless or even cruel, sadly, that's what you're sublimating, so that you can be more your true self. The idea is that your true self is in union with the divine constantly. The fullness of who you are, the fullness of your connection with God, for Tomberg at least, is the full expression of the human self. Yeah, so there's not really ever a division within the self. It's more just like sublimation of the sinner and the elevation that allows the divine light to shine through the union of mystical connection with God. So there you go. That answers those questions. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now and we can have a little chat.